All right, welcome everyone. So hopefully all the attendees, I can see their names over there listed. We're so happy to see so many people that are here. I am Professor Megan Sholar in the Interdisciplinary Honors Program. And we are really excited about this very topical debate between some current honors students and some honors alums. So thank you to everyone in the audience for coming, and thank you so much for the participants. I want to just take a second and ask all of the participants if they will just briefly introduce themselves. We'll start with the current students. If you just want to tell us your name and maybe your year, major, anything that you would like us to know about you. So we'll start with the current students, maybe Katrina.
Yeah, hi, my name is Katrina. I'm a current freshman. My major is in classical civilization and in art history.
Excellent. Junaid.
Hello, everyone. It's good to see everyone. My name is Junaid, and I am a freshman neuroscience major.
Excellent. Thank you, Callie.
Hi, my name's Callie. I'm a junior student majoring in political science and communication studies.
Excellent. Amaan.
Hi, I'm Amaan. I'm a freshman. I'm majoring in neuroscience as well.
And Mary, our last current student.
To wrap it all up, my name is Mary. Good evening, everyone, and I'm a sophomore majoring in political science.
Excellent. Thank you so much. So welcome to all of you. And let's hear quickly from the alums then. So Maureen, you want to start us off?
Yeah, hi, my name is Maureen. I'm a 2016 grad. I have degrees in communication and graphic design. Currently based here in Chicago. I'm a user experience designer at Morningstar, which is a research and data firm.
Excellent. Rory.
Hi, I'm Rory. I graduated in class of 2017. I was an econ major. Right now I'm a staff accountant with Harris Insights and Analytics in Chicago.
Excellent. Michael, who has traveled the farthest for this Zoom presentation.
Hi, everyone. My name is Michael. I graduated in 2020 with a degree in chemistry. I'm currently taking a gap year traveling around New Zealand and applying to medical school.
Excellent. And Tom, finish it off here for us.
Well, I think I'm the old guy in the room. I'm a 2014 grad and a veteran of both Dr. Sholar and Dr. Whidden. Went on to medical school at SIU and did a little bit of residency and decided to jump into academia. And so you may see me around campus if we ever get back to campus. I am currently teaching biology 242 and next semester 243 over in the biology department.
Wonderful. I like bridging all the gaps. So there you go for the current students. We can you get an idea of what some of the honor students of the past have done. So thank you so much for that, everyone. As I said, we're so thankful that you volunteered to participate in this debate. And we also want to make sure we encourage audience participation throughout the debate. So if you, down at the bottom of your screen, there's the Q&A. So we're hoping you'll use the Q&A link rather than going into the chat. And throughout, if you in the audience have questions, please just type them in there. The director of the honors program, Professor Virginia Strain, she has volunteered to help Professor Whidden and me sort of sift through those questions throughout the presentation. And then at the end, she'll sort of moderate that question and answer period for us. So if a question pops up for you during the debate, just go ahead and submit it through the Q&A and we'll get to them at the end. So now I think that's it for me. I'm going to hand it over to Professor Whidden, and he's going to give us a little more info about the specifics of the topic, and then we'll jump right in.
Thank you, Professor Sholar. I'd also like to thank the third member of our team who will be joining us, Professor Strain, as well as the panelists themselves, who have been working diligently these last few weeks to get ready for this debate. As I was thinking about our topic for tonight, the Electoral College, it occurred to me that the Electoral College is one of the oldest mechanisms and controversies in our republic, one that dates all the way back to the original unamended United States Constitution, which speaks in Article 2, Section 1, of electors voting by ballot for president in the respective states. If we think about some of the most significant controversies and shortcomings of the original unamended Constitution, slavery and voting rights, of course, come immediately to mind here. Many of these were gradually remedied, often by constitutional amendment. One thinks here of the Reconstruction Amendments, as well as the 19th Amendment. But the way we choose a president has persisted, with minor modifications, but more or less unchanged, from the founding to the present day. Is this longevity a sign that the Electoral College has been a faithful and effective ally of American democracy? Or does the long shelf life of the Electoral College mean that it is a kind of bizarre vestigial remnant that needs to be excised for the good of the body politic? This brings me to the proposition we'll debate tonight. Resolved that the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness. The students indicated they wanted to argue in favor of the proposition, and the alums have agreed to argue against it. It's time for opening statements. It was decided by coin flip that the alums will speak first. Alums, take about 10 minutes and please make your opening statement.
All right, I'm going to kick things off. Thanks again for having us, and hi to the current students. So in 2 of the last 5 elections, the election was decided by the Electoral College in favor of the candidate who lost the popular vote. It is very understandable that we should be examining it right now, questioning whether it serves our democracy as intended and whether it's worth preserving. You'll find the original plan for how the Electoral College was meant to function in Article 2, Section 1, Clause 3 of the Constitution. And although it's nearly 250 years old, we believe it has evolved along with our country, and we believe it will and should continue to exist. Congress has seen over 700 proposals to reform or eliminate the Electoral College, and none have passed. We find this to be telling. The debate is long and storied and will definitely continue well after this Zoom call this evening. But the fact that the Electoral College is here doesn't mean that it's perfect, but we think there are many significant reasons that it has not and may never outlive its usefulness. Tonight, you'll hear our arguments in defense of the preservation of the Electoral College. These include the idea that our government is first and foremost a federal one, and the Electoral College underscores and enables that. Second, the logistics of implementing a national popular vote, which is often suggested as an alternative, are nearly impossible to overcome and carry enormous risk. Above all, we maintain that the Electoral College still has important use in our modern society, notably by providing a moderating influence as intended by the nation's founders. Ultimately, we believe that there are significant opportunities to reform the Electoral College, but that those are better than repealing it. Today, or this evening, we will look to our opponents to address some of our criticisms and questions of their position, and we do intend to have a lively discussion about those. So at this point, I'd like to turn it back to the moderators, who I'm sure have some great questions lined up for us that'll allow us to dig into some of those problems that we see inherent in eliminating the Electoral College.
All right, thank you, Maureen. Let's now turn it over to the students. Students, you have 10 minutes to make your opening remarks.
We affirm that resolved, the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness. The 12th Amendment modifying Article 2, Section 1 of the Constitution was ratified in 1804 after the Electoral College failed to come to a consensus for the president. It states that the person having the greatest number of votes for president shall be the president, if such a number be the majority of the whole number of electors appointed. These electors are appointed, quote, in such a way as the legislature thereof may direct, and are held to no constitutional mandate to vote alongside the will of their constituents. They are, however, not allowed to hold any office of trust or power in the United States, insinuating that the framers intended for people, not state or federal legislators, to be the ones selecting the president. Having a small amount of electoral votes decide the president made sense in 1787 because counting 5 million votes on a federal scale would have been quite impossible given their resources. Making elections be a smaller pool of people after the states have counted their votes made sense logistically in the time period of the framers, but is no longer an issue now. In the same sense, the Senate was originally elected by state legislators in order to establish the Senate as an upper house of Congress. However, in 1913, the 17th Amendment was ratified that changed the system of electing senators to a direct election of the people from their states. This was because, in part, the people realized that the old system was outdated and there was a need for the Senate to represent the people directly instead of representing the needs of their state legislators. Thus, we can adopt this idea and translate it directly to the presidency to see that the Electoral College has indeed outlived its usefulness.
The opposition would have you believe that the Electoral College has grown with our country and with the Constitution. But understand that the Electoral College is actually an archaic and highly contentious institution which has caused more chaos than calm in some of our most vital presidential elections in all of America's history. While the Electoral College may have begun life as a useful political tool in the Founding Fathers' toolbox, it has now outlived that usefulness. There are two main reasons to justify why the Electoral College no longer has utility and why we should abolish it. First, by abolishing the Electoral College, we actually uphold constitutional flexibility and the original intention of the Founding Fathers in creating it. And second, four simple words: one person, one vote.
The first thing to realize is that the Constitution was created with an inherent purpose of being updated by each successive generation so as to fit the needs of the people and the times. As history is testament, the Constitution has changed and been updated in many forms over the past 2.5 centuries. This illustrates the notion that the Constitution is meant to be updated for modern times, and modern times demand that the Electoral College be abolished due to it having outlived its usefulness. It is also important to understand the context in which the Electoral College was created. It was created for a fledgling nation tied together by strings and crushed under educational and logistical barriers, as well as great political divisions, problems which do not exist today at all or do not exist at the same scale. Furthermore, the Electoral College was created in an uneducated and slave-holding society that looks different from the America we know today. Such problems no longer exist, as while once education was rare and illiteracy was high, things have greatly changed. On top of all this, there is widespread access to plethora of news sources which keep the American public informed. Some of the reasons that people bring up to keep it is, in the past, there were logistical issues, and maybe the founders didn't trust the American people of making such important decisions. These are extremely outdated, and these align with those notions at the time of voter suppression, such as Black people not being able to vote, women, or people who did not own property. While these things have been cast aside and abolished, the Electoral College still exists.
Following that, let's talk about some of the things that has changed that the Electoral College just doesn't reflect in the status quo. Namely, the changing demographic landscape of the United States. The founders didn't expect a lot of the population increases and shifts that we've seen throughout history to the modern day. Namely, the Great Migration after the Civil War and of the 1970s that has changed disproportionately the demographic landscape of the United States. James Madison hoped that slavery would eventually end and that the Electoral College would reflect the votes of Black populations equally as white, but that's just not true today in 2020. Minority voters are disadvantaged by the Electoral College in a system that already functions against them. Just look to the Compromise of 1877, when Rutherford B. Hayes won the Electoral College and not the popular vote. In fact, Democratic candidate Samuel J. Tilden actually had 51.5% of the vote in the election of 1876. There were 20 contested votes, and a commission was formed of 7 Democrats and 8 Republicans that gave Rutherford B. Hayes 20 contested votes. This was not democratic. This was not political. This was not the intent of the Electoral College to give 20 contested votes to Rutherford B. Hayes because of the basis of a political compromise to remove federal troops protecting Black people in the South. Those 20 votes were not the choice of the electorate or the choice of the popular public, but rather it was a choice to entrench white supremacy and make sure that the federal government would remove troops from the South. This effectively ended Reconstruction and ushered in an era of institutions that continue to support white supremacy to our present day, hour, and minute, right now as we speak. So Ms. Baynes, regarding your discussion of logistics, if you want something impossible to overcome, ask the Black women living in urban areas in this country what the Electoral College does to their vote. Because the Great Migration means that the Electoral College was not just the end of Reconstruction, but the devaluation of the Black, the brown, and the queer vote today, whereas white people in rural areas are systematically overrepresented in the executive election. So that's why we desperately need one person, one vote in this country, rather than allow white people to continue harmful white institutions in a country that was made for all.
So one of the fundamental convictions of the Electoral College system was this concept that Mary was just talking about, one person, one vote. But this isn't the way it works now. It was intended to balance the power of the states, specifically the big states, against the small states. However, the way the Electoral College apportions electors in turn creates an imbalance in a different way. Instead of between states, it's by voter weight. See what I did there? For instance, one electoral vote in Texas represents 664,000 people, where one in Vermont represents 210,000 people. In California, it represents 679,000 people, where in Wyoming, it represents 189,000 people. Out of fear of tyranny of the majority, the founders instead created a system that created a tyranny of the minority. And this imbalance has negative implications on the perception of American democracy today, like with voter turnout. Voter turnout is higher when people think their vote matters. In this previous election, the national average of voter turnout was 66.4%. And in swing states, the states that ultimately decide elections with the Electoral College, the voter turnout percentage was 72%. That's 5.6% higher than the national average. And another good example of this from 2020 is the state of Texas. Texas was considered a battleground state this year, apparently. And voter turnout was 10% higher this year than it was in 2016. No matter what you can say about the causal relationship, there is some correlation between increased voter turnout and the belief that your vote matters.
Another consequence of this division between the popular vote and the electoral vote is the legitimacy of the presidency. 5 times in history, a president has won without the popular vote. Adams, Hayes, Harrison, Bush, and Trump all took the role of POTUS without the support of the majority. This creates a rift in the American people by suggesting that their votes do not matter, making people question the legitimacy of the administration itself. Take the example of the 2016 election. Though Trump won the Electoral College handedly, 306 to 232, he lost the popular vote by almost 3 million. This impacted his administration as people did not believe he represented the majority, which he did not by a vote basis. In the upcoming 2020 administration, people will question whoever becomes president purely because of the Electoral College's influence. Had it been a popular vote, this would have ended as an election night instead of what it has become, an election nightmare. By using a national popular vote, you legitimize the incoming administration to be representing the will of the people, and as such will have a more efficient and well-seen stay in power. The Electoral College is outdated. It no longer wishes or follows the wishes of the founders. It has a historical and current function of suppressing Black voters in the US. It decreases voter turnout, and it hurts the legitimacy of the presidential election. For these reasons, and none more needed, we resolve the Electoral College has outlived its usefulness.
All right, thank you to the students. Lots to think about there. I want to now pose a question to the alums. And I notice that many of the students touched on this in their remarks, so I'll be very curious to hear the alum response to this. This is the idea that while it might be true that all votes within a state, and states are the election districts in question, all votes within a state may well count equally. Professor Sholar's vote counts no more and no less than my vote counts in the state of Illinois. But as many of the participants have noticed, that's not true across states. And in particular, rural states have disproportionate representation. And because of the formula by which electors are delegated, rural states seem to have a disproportionate amount of influence on the presidential election. I wonder, alums, what would you say to the students who have raised that issue that might satisfy them? You have 5 minutes.
So firstly, I would say to the students that just because the Electoral College has the role of elector need not mean that small states necessarily be extremely favored. The number of electors hasn't changed since the early 20th century, where after 1925 and the Apportionment Act, there are no longer any representatives added to the House of Representatives. So one solution could be simply to use the so-called Wyoming rule, where the smallest conceivable district is 1 representative, and then everything scales proportionally, which would remove that mismatch between the small states and the large states. Additionally, you could remove the office of elector completely and just have it be a certain number of so-called points given to each state.
All right, do any of the other, you do have a little bit of time remaining. Do any of the other alums have a response? The floor is yours if you like.
Additionally, it was the intention of the founders to have a protective influence of the Electoral College on the sanctity or preservation of a rural vote against an urban vote, not so much a large state versus a small state. Recall that at the time of the founding, US was an agrarian society. 1 in 50 people lived in an urban area, and now we have just the opposite, 1 in 50 people living in a rural area. And so, as far as the usefulness, the intent of the Electoral College was to protect a rural perspective, and we see that it continues to serve that exact purpose.
The last point I would add to that is that the Constitution and the Electoral College were designed for the long term. When we look at the population and the distribution of our population today, yes, everything points to continued urbanization, but I think we do need to think about how, with the climate changing and with populations changing, the shift of population across the country is going to continue to change. What might look like disenfranchisement today might end up being a really drastic shift in population tomorrow. So I think we need to allow for the Electoral College to respond to that and to kind of solve for that and mediate for that over time, rather than responding to what we see in the short term, for example, the last 20 years, where there have been more examples of the popular vote contrasting with the Electoral College.
I'm going to jump in and add a quick follow-up to the alums, and then we'll get to some questions for the students, and especially with regard to the sort of urban-rural debate. And as Tom pointed out, originally there was certainly built into the Electoral College this idea of protecting rural votes, and we talk about the need for it still today to make sure that rural areas are well represented. But from what I've seen, rural voters are still overlooked by the Electoral College today. So for example, in the 2016 election, since we don't have 2020, all the data is in yet. In the 2016 election, if you look at the last 2 months of the campaigning between Clinton and Kaine and Trump and Pence, they spent most of their time in 4 states. And like, for example, one of them was Pennsylvania, and they spent over 70% of their time in Pittsburgh and Philadelphia. And so when you look at that, where it's really just become a number of swing states or battleground states that people visit, similarly in Michigan, most of the time was spent in Grand Rapids and Detroit when you look at where Clinton and Trump spent their time. So if you're making an argument that it protects rural voters, the numbers just don't actually support that today. When you look at where campaigning is happening, when you look at the types of issues that the politicians are campaigning on, they're still targeted primarily at those urban areas, which is an argument that people in favor of having moving to a popular vote would say, yes, let's go to where more votes are. It seems they're already doing that. The Electoral College isn't preventing that. So how would you respond to that criticism?
Well, first I would say that looking at location of campaigning isn't necessarily a one-to-one proxy, in the sense of you're not going to go to one person's farm 5 miles from anything else, when you can just go to one location and all the rural voters come to the rally or fundraiser. Sorry, I lost my train of thought. In addition, just because they're not necessarily campaigning in the rural voters' backyards doesn't mean they're not campaigning in the rural voters' interests. It's more about protecting what the politician will do in office, rather than necessarily simply trying to win their votes, which is ultimately more substantive at the end of the day.
Additionally, I would say that there are regions of states that adopt a rural mentality, even if they are not quite within the threshold as far as population size. I think one local example would be the thought of how Illinois is divided. Largely for Chicago natives, the thought of Illinois is there's Chicago and there's corn, as far as the rest of the state of Illinois. And for those downstate, there's the sense that I-80 should be the new state border and to divide Chicago out. And so I would highlight the concept that there are states that adopt a rural identity, even if they have population centers that fit into the urban qualification.
If we have time for one more point on this topic, I'd also just like to push on the question of like, what is the alternative here? Because I think in a national popular vote, there's a risk of it becoming, of this issue of kind of isolated or narrow campaigning going even further to the extreme of the campaigns kind of doing the math of which particular singular city might have the numbers to sway the vote, and really even targeting campaigning further. Or perhaps on the flip side, we see the really aggressive digital campaigning that went on in this election just go even further to the extreme. You see more disinformation, conflicting messages, targeting an even wider range of voters digitally, and the messages just become more chaotic and less centralized. So I think there are kind of risks on both extreme in the national popular vote model.
All right, thank you. I have a question for the students to think about now. One of the interesting parts of the Electoral College is that it tends to magnify or enlarge the margin of victory. And so thinking about our most recent election from a couple of weeks ago, in terms of the raw national popular vote, Biden didn't win by that much. What, 5 million? Do I have that right? Which sounds like a lot, but statistically, it's actually not much at all in a nation this size. And so think about that for a second. If President-elect Biden only had the popular vote to point to, that's not much of a mandate. There's not much that he can point to bring a divided country together. However, with the Electoral College and its tendency to magnify the size of the president-elect's victory, President-elect Biden can now come into office and he can point to the Electoral College numbers and he can argue that he has a convincing mandate to govern. My question is, isn't this one of the advantages of the Electoral College, that it gives president-elects, people of good faith, the ability to come in to office and try to get something done, particularly in the first couple of years in which they govern? Students, what do you think about that idea?
So I would start out challenging this notion that it creates a mandate to rule it all, because in 2016, President Trump also won the Electoral College and lost the popular vote to Hillary Clinton. And I don't necessarily think that that made him a more legitimate president in the eyes of the American people. In fact, I would say that his mandate to govern comes from the institutions of our country and the Constitution rather than the Electoral College. All the Electoral College did was deprive the popular vote of its saliency. So to say that either Trump or Biden winning the Electoral College makes them a more effective executive is to look past the reality of the last 4 years. Trump has not governed because he won the Electoral College. He won because he was placed into office by an institution, and other institutions supported his rule from there on out. It's a similar thing with Biden. He needs to, first, all the election results haven't been counted yet. Second of all, there will be court challenges before the inauguration. And third of all, Biden needs to ascend to office. The Electoral College has not made any of that process easier. It has not stopped Trump from challenging a peaceful transition. And in fact, it did not push President Trump to recognize the victory of President-elect Joe Biden any earlier. So there is no real evidence to say that the Electoral College actually enhances the mandate to rule or makes the country more stable.
I would also like to kind of look at the root of your question in that a lot of our elections do turn out to be rather 50-50. They're really close. I would argue that that is a result of the Electoral College. Our winner-take-all system really encourages a two-party system to have developed in this country, and it means that people will vote less for a president that fits their viewpoints, but rather for this person who is vaguely close to what they think of, that they think could get that 50% plus one vote. For example, you saw a huge consensus of people saying that they were settling for Biden. That is a product of the Electoral College because people are less likely to vote for candidates that fit their perception and their political stances more. So if we got rid of the Electoral College, it would encourage more, the word's blanking on me, factions, as James Madison encouraged in Federalist 10 to have factions having open debate, having competition among them. The 50-51 votes that we've seen are a result of the Electoral College encouraging hyperpartisanism and encouraging a two-party system that our framers discouraged, as seen in George Washington's farewell address.
This also links to our overall impacts, where we talk about how this provides greater voter turnout. We already see in swing states or battleground states per se, we have an increased voter turnout. If we turn this into a national system, we're going to see more people vote off of that precedent alone. But a second point is also, again, the legitimacy of the presidency. Every time a president wins without the popular vote, there is that strain of delegitimizing the presidency because people feel that the president doesn't reflect the overall American people. By getting rid of this strain of thinking overall, this isn't an issue. The president who is elected will represent the people. There is no battleground between it is what it is.
I'm going to jump in really quick here. Sorry, I saw you get ready to talk there. I just want to add a quick follow-up question to that. With the idea of having that popular vote, then, do you see a problem, since you were sort of responding to this idea that the Electoral College doesn't properly give a mandate, but it would if you had a popular vote? What happens when you have 5 candidates who run and no one gets close to a majority of votes? So what Professor Whidden was talking about with, you always have that mandate of, with the Electoral College, you have won a majority. You will have gotten that majority, and you can point to that. It seems very likely that if we had a straight popular vote, it would be very difficult for people to get a majority, because as what Katrina pointed out, you would have people perhaps more so voting their conscience, and they wouldn't feel the need to have that two-party system, which could be a positive, but the negative could be that you do have very divided politics, and you might end up with someone winning the presidency with 30% of the vote, which seems to give them no mandate and may make it difficult for them to rule at all. So how would the students follow up with that?
So a pluralistic system would not just incur changes in the way we vote and perceive the presidency, but also in the way that we vote officials into the other branches of government. If we had multiple parties being elected for the presidency, we would see more parties also in the House and in the Senate. As you see in several European countries that use a parliamentary or a proportional system of representation. You might not always have a 50% lead, but because it would allow more parties to be represented in Congress, it would mean that we would also lose this gridlock of you have to have 50% of senators to do anything as a president. So it would not only allow more people to vote with their conscience for the president, even if we had someone with less than 50% elected, there would still be a chance for the people that were not elected to have a voice because they would likely also get representatives in Congress.
Not to mention that the Electoral College does not solve the problems that single-member district voting creates in our democracy, as Katrina stated, because there's a political science concept called Duverger's law, where if you have more than two parties, and if Party A wins 30% and Party B wins 25% and Party C wins 15%, if that adds up to more than 100, I'm not a math major for a reason, but if you have Party A winning by a smaller margin than the simple majority, Party B and C are going to become one party in order to beat Party A in the next election, right? That's Duverger's law, explained as simply as I can put it. The problem with that is that the Electoral College didn't fix that. If anything, it entrenched it. It made sure that voters were always going to pick between those two options. If we get rid of the Electoral College, we actually create a world in which proportional representation systems can begin to exist in the United States and make multi-party systems viable. And yes, those concerns about stability are absolutely valid. You can just look at Belgium in 2017 when they weren't able to form a coalition government over and over again because of the way that the elections took place. However, the key thing to remember here is that those are issues with the election system, regardless of whether or not it's a national popular vote or the Electoral College. That problem exists in both worlds. But if you abolish the Electoral College, you get rid of a lot of representation problems that would still exist with it. Overall, by getting rid of the Electoral College, we create a more representative, more democratic world for Americans.
Professor Sholar, I wanted to give you the opportunity, if you have a question for the alums, to go ahead and ask it, and then we're going to move to questions from our audience out there in Zoom land.
Unmute myself. Yes, I do have, and I have a couple of questions here. I will just go with one because Maureen, when you started, you articulated that the system is, is not perfect, but obviously has not outlived its usefulness. And you did talk about some reforms, and I think it was Michael that mentioned potentially a couple that could be enacted. But in what ways, if you're talking about it as kind of as always a shifting to keep up with the country today, how might you reform the Electoral College, or are you willing to sort of just give it a 100% backing as it is now? So does your group, by supporting the need to retain the Electoral College, are you saying you should retain it exactly as it is? Or are there some reforms that you think should go along with it, since your argument is this is an evolving, this has evolved over the last 200 years? How might you see it evolving? Or do you think it has evolved to the point where this is the best system that we should have?
I can kick things off on that topic. We do think that it stands to be reformed. We, for the purposes of the debate, definitely back it on the points that we've talked about. But as for possible reforms, one of the ones we mentioned was representation. And I think Tom can maybe speak to some ideas about how the census actually comes into play. And when we think about the election being a truly representative of the population, that there are actually ways the Electoral College helps accomplish that. The other major reform we'd like to suggest is just a mechanism to remove the possibility of faithless electors. I think that's often brought up as an argument against the Electoral College, and we think that is a pretty easy fix right now. There aren't a lot of states, like some states kind of could find somebody a faithless elector, but that seems like an easy solution to at least guarantee that the popular vote of the state is reflected in the elector's choice. And maybe Tom, can I pass it over to you to talk about the representation with the census?
Yes, if I can get my microphone to work. So our opposing panel has brought up this notion of one person, one vote, and there be equal weighting. But let's remember that not every American citizen is granted the right to vote. of our 330 million Americans, we have only 240 who are eligible voting population. And it seems that we had approximately 90 million abstain this year. On that note, when we look at the apportionment of electors within our electoral college, we look to the census. The census driving the districting and the apportionment in the House of Representatives, and it trickles down into the electoral college. And so who is in that proportionment? Not only our nation's 70 million minors, but additionally 20 million legal residents with an additional 10 million or so undocumented residents. And so votes based on the Electoral College give indirect representation to those populations, a population of 90 million people on American soil. If we were to go to a national popular vote, that 90 million people on US soil loses their voice in the selection of our executive branch. And so I would pose the question to our current students: how would this national popular vote strategy allow for representation of this 90 million strong portion of America?
Students, I believe the question Professor Hu has addressed was to you, just to be clear.
Tom, do you want to repeat exactly, summarize your question?
So conceptually, we look at this 2020 election, which has had the highest voter turnout in 120 years. And we look at it as being around 65%, so around 150 million voters. So we had 90 million people abstain from voting who were eligible, or possibly 90 million who were suppressed. But in addition to that, we have 90 million people on American soil, some of them naturalized American citizens, whether they be minors or whether they be convicted felons who may have been convicted in federal mandates and statutes that were not necessarily fair or equitable. These are people who do not have the right to vote and have been disenfranchised for whatever identity reason. With a national popular vote strategy, we have those 90 million people unable to access representation for the selection of our president. So how would your strategy in repealing the Electoral College replace it with something more equitable?
I guess I'm just a little bit confused on why a national popular vote wouldn't represent those people. Sorry, just one more time. I don't know if you can clarify that, how the Electoral College system does versus why, or how does the Electoral College system help them out?
Hypothetically, let's say I am a farmer in Utah and I have 9 children, all of whom are American citizens. And the vote that I place for the president, I expect it to be useful in the apportionment of or setting the tone as far as fiscal spending for roads and schools in my community in Utah. And when I vote with the Electoral College, my children were counted in the census. And so the power of my vote is proportioned by the number of people in my household and in my community. If it were a national popular vote, my vote counts, but my 9 children no longer have representation, direct or indirect.
Well, I guess my response to that, this isn't the best response, but people who vote in elections are people that can vote. And I think the popular vote would solve that to some extent, because more people vote when more people think that their vote matters. So I think you mentioned about, well, I don't remember the number, but a certain percentage of registered voters, I think it's about 40%, don't vote in the election. They don't turn out. And you just have to wonder if one of the reasons why someone wouldn't turn out to vote is maybe they think like, oh, my vote doesn't matter. I know people that in Illinois think, oh, I'm a red voter in a blue state, my vote doesn't matter. So I think the national popular vote would increase voter turnout, which is kind of a better solution than do you know what I'm saying? That more people will vote.
Well, my caveat to that stance would be that assumes that the lack of turnout is due to voter apathy. When we have
I didn't say it's I didn't say that. I just thought maybe like you might wonder like that might be a reason.
Right. Okay. So assuming that we don't have a definitive reason for people who don't turn out, we can take a look at instances within swing states where there's a higher incentive to disenfranchise voters when they are not part of your political persuasion, whether it be through voter ID law or if we go back historically looking at poll taxes or voter testing. And we can see that that is an influence largely in swing states and often not an influence in the so-called safe states. In a national popular vote, every state is a swing state. And so how would your conception of a national popular vote prevent a spillover of the incentive to suppress votes, not only in swing states, but every state?
So I guess I'm a little bit confused at your question because you're saying that like having a national popular vote wouldn't include the voices of the people who aren't even old enough to vote yet. But how does the Electoral College not create issues by like a farmer in California whose vote will never matter if they vote Republican because the state is so solid blue? Having a popular vote or an altered electoral system would mean that everyone's vote would actually matter versus just in solid states, as you're saying, the people who vote against the party that it's solid, it doesn't matter. So an electoral system, it has its flaws. A popular vote institution has flaws, but not more than the Electoral College already has. I apologize too for my camera issues. I like left and then came back.
Right. So I think California is a wonderful example of an entrenched state, but let's look at a large population state that historically has been consistently safe, Texas. Texas has always been thought of as a red state, but in this current election, there was serious polling and expectation that it may become a toss-up. So the assumption that votes are always suppressed in the smaller party in a safe state is a little bit of a fallacy because with shifting demographics, any state has the possibility of becoming a swing state. And if you look at the Electoral College map over the last 150 years, you can see that no state is always a swing state, but there is a shift and a general rotation of that title.
Every state should always be a swing state because that would represent the people in that state.
I'd also add, we're looking somewhat on the incentive structure on an individual level, where we're pretending we're a voter in a particular state, and I don't have an incentive to vote because everyone else in the state is voting, and then it's suddenly safe. But if everyone thinks that way, suddenly it's not a safe state. So there is a certain proportion of people who are exercising their right to vote, even though they may characterize it as a safe state. And if you look at a map of the voter turnout percentages in each state for 2016, yes, the swing states have slightly higher by about 10 to 15% more, but in the grand scheme of things, it's not that large compared to this great injustice that it's being cast as.
I just have one question based on what you just said. So we should encourage a system that perpetuates voter apathy so that eventually enough people will think their vote doesn't matter that it becomes a swing state?
Yeah, I'd love to chime in on this. And Katrina, I think you bring up a great point that like that situation in California there, I think that what we're proposing in terms of reform and having more proportional representation kind of seeks to address that. But I think the conversation about whether the kind of system of election encourages or discourages voters to participate or to be apathetic or interested, whatever, I don't know that has legs here. And I'm specifically thinking of, I point to the work of Ofer Berenstein. He's a voter encouragement specialist who I kind of happened to follow a couple of months ago. I've shared a video of his on my LinkedIn account that I find very fascinating. And I think he does a great job of breaking down like the psychology of why people vote. And I think everything in his work points to the idea that people aren't necessarily all that tuned into, oh, is this a popular vote? Is this going to go through the Electoral College? It's kind of more how they view democracy. Do they view democracy as a system, a tool to help them get what they want, or as this like value and this ideal? And if you kind of create a matrix of these different views of how people see democracy and their duties or rights as a citizen to abstain or participate, it's really those people who kind of view themselves as having a right to vote as much as they have a right not to vote, and see democracy as a tool, but not really like a kind of something that they hold a values-based affinity for. Those are the people who aren't voting. So the large majority probably is going to vote because of their value and connection to it, rather than how it's actually functioning.
So
just
if I could just, oh, sorry, go ahead, Mr. Whidden.
No, please, Mary, go ahead. The floor is yours.
If I could just get some clarification on that, Ms. Baynes, are you saying that in any system, voters would choose not to vote over time?
No, and you can call me Maureen. I am saying that there are kind of just a percentage of the population that psychologically doesn't feel, given the choice, like living in a democracy where they can choose not to vote, where they're not obligated to vote, they just won't. And I don't think that's necessarily going to trend in one way or another. You're going to have people, whether it's based on education, upbringing, who kind of value their right to vote, or those who see it as this more utilitarian choice that they can make or not. I don't know that trends one way or another. I'm definitely not an expert on this, though.
No, for sure. And I appreciate that clarification. I just think it's interesting that we have Tom explaining to us that the Electoral College is actually diminishing voters and taking away a form of representation. And then we have us that, well, actually, there are some people who aren't going to vote no matter what. So I'm just confused on who the Electoral College is then serving. Is the Electoral College promoting voting? Does it not matter because people aren't going to vote anyway? Is it that electors are representing 90 million people who never got to cast a vote? Because it seems like there's a lot of inconsistencies here that still aren't acknowledging our base argument that the Electoral College provides for one person, one vote, which increases the amount of democratic representation no matter how you cut the cake, right? You have this, right now you have voters who are being devalued by the Electoral College. When you remove that institution, their votes are valued at the same capacity. And that may not change some of the problems that you and Tom bring up, but it does change one big problem. The fact that right now, coastal and urban voters are represented less than rural ones are, which was not the intent of the Constitution, was not the intent of a free and fair election, and was not the intent of America being a representative democracy.
So, Mary, the way I would respond to that would be the end of the Electoral College is not necessarily to create the most democratic society. If that is the case, then yes, we should just move to a direct popular vote. That's going to be the most democratic engagement. What it's actually seeking to do is creating a stable society that works best for the American populace at large, which is a bit of a different question. And we can debate how well it's actually serving that end, but I push back a little bit on the characterization that the founders intended it to just be this pure engagement with democracy, where that democracy is the end unto itself.
Well, one of the major reasons that the Founding Fathers instituted the Electoral College was because they thought voters weren't educated enough to decide on their own. And Junaid very eloquently in our opening argument stated that now Americans are more educated, therefore meaning that misinformation or that stupidity, to put it in frank terms, isn't going to get in the way. And at no point, unless I missed it somewhere, did the Founding Fathers explicitly state that stability is their goal. Yes, that's part of political theory. Yes, that's part of a lot of Machiavellian tactics of running a state. But Our side is arguing that democracy is the more important value in this debate and that the Electoral College actively gets in the way of that. With creating severe consequences for groups like Black Americans, like queer Americans, like any Americans who are living in these underrepresented areas. So yes, perhaps we have a more stable society, but it's also a more racist, white supremacist, inequitable, and oppressive one.
So, Michael, I want to answer your question a little bit, going back to what the framers knew and what the framers were afraid of and what the framers intended, because the framers had a very good understanding of how Athenian democracy and classical democracy worked. They understood that having popular votes was not always the best thing. You have Athenian democracy voting itself out and then coming back in. So I recognize that the Electoral College was an attempt to not have that happen. But we have to look at the writings of the framers, of James Madison embracing pluralism, of them looking at Aristotle, who wanted there to be multiple groups. A good thing is when you have multiple groups that kind of create decisions and find compromises among them. And our argument is simply that the Electoral College no longer fosters that debate among groups and instead creates a polarized, hyper-partisan two-party system that, if we're talking about framers' intents, this is not what they intended to happen. They intended for us to evolve and change once we realized that these issues were happening.
Michael, if I could, I'm sorry to cut you off. I really wish that I didn't have to.
No worries.
It looks like a debate has broken out. I want to make a pitch to those out there on Zoom or watching on YouTube, on the Honors YouTube channel. This is what we do in the honors program here at Loyola University. As I sit here, I had a whole agenda in mind here, questions that I wanted to get to, and as normally happens in the honors seminar at Loyola University Chicago, after 5 minutes of professors leading the way, Professor Sholar and I just get out of the way and let the students take over, and that's what it's all about. And anything I were to say at this point would be a tough act to follow. I do want to send it over to the head of the honors program, Professor Strain, the third member of our team tonight, to see if there are any questions from the audience. Now would be a good time.
There are lots, Chris, and we can't address all of them. And I'm torn between addressing the more, giving voice to the more abstract or more concrete and detailed ones. A lot of people responded to Tom's comments about the Electoral College and the representation of these 90 million who can't vote. And everybody wants to know why Tom thinks the 9 children would have agreed with their father on who to vote for. So I'll just summarize a whole bunch of comments by saying that. And as a Canadian, by the way, I have found this entire conversation fascinating. And if you're prone to idealize parliamentary systems, I could easily disabuse you of that in the future. So if we start here, Gareth Mullins has been really engaged by this debate, and he wants to know, one of his earliest questions was, he wants to know whether or not the establishment of winner-take-all states within the Electoral College helps or hinders efforts to increase representation.
Well, let's throw that to the students or to the alums, whoever wants that.
I'll speak on that. So we argue on the student side that it actually hurts representation. So we've already shown the correlation between voter turnout and if the state is a swing or not. We see that when voters feel like their votes matter more, then they come out and vote, right? Tom mentioned 90 million voters abstaining from vote, and that can be chipped away if we get more voter turnout. Having a winner-takes-all situation means that in some states where I know it's going to be blue or red, there are voters that feel disheartened, and they feel that even if they vote, it does not matter, as certain areas of the population would just take care of it and make that state blue or red or per se, and as such will not vote. And again, going back to what I said earlier, just by having a close vote, when your vote feels like it matters more, that 50-50, voters come out. This increases representation overall, and that is the true purpose of our democracy. We should be having a greater representation of the American people.
This is another one from Gareth. The Supreme Court ruled unanimously back in July that electors must vote based on the popular vote of their constituents. Does this furthermore tie the Electoral College to the popular vote as a whole? Does it make the Electoral, I'm unmuted, sorry. Does it make the Electoral College more democratic, or does it make it superfluous?
I don't think this would change much because since states are in charge of the time, place, and manner of their own elections, there are still numerous areas where suppression can simply decide whether or not a state will go any one way. And faithless electors haven't necessarily been a huge impact in the recent past. So it is a good thing that they're doing that because it is tying more to the national popular vote, but I don't think that it makes the Electoral College any more democratic than it is right now.
There's a toddler yelling in the background. This is a question for the students. Who says that voters are educated now? Would it make sense to get rid of the Electoral College, but make voters take a test before voting to make sure they are in fact educated? I have a question on top of that. We know that with the SATs, that the number you had to reach, right, has gone up and up and up and up. And so that I read this a long time ago, but what we consider to be, or IQ tests, IQ tests too, in terms of what's considered intelligent and what's not, have gone up and up and up and up in terms of the expected number. So what do you mean when you say voters are more educated today?
I'm going to let my colleagues answer this, but I want to start just by saying that standardized testing and most testing is inherently racist and disadvantages minorities, but I'm going to let my peers finish.
Fair enough, but then what does it mean to be more educated?
Yeah, when we look at that society, people didn't have that same type of access to news sources. They didn't have the same ability to consume information to make their own independent, opinions. And that has significantly changed in recent times. I mean, we live in the times called the age of information. So I think part of this question was also whether or not we should have some form of testing at these polling centers, which I think if we look at our own history, that's kind of illegal, and that would be very bad.
I would push back on the current abundance of information as a pure good thing. As we've seen with this most recent election, disinformation is on the rise and is becoming very apparent, not only from domestic actors who have an agenda, but also from international actors who wish to sway the election for their own ends. So the amount of information is not all the same quality. An article from a Russian troll mill is not the same as an article from the New York Times. So just because voters think they're more educated does not necessarily mean they have the right information to make a rational choice for the interest of the country.
Yeah, so demagogues have always and will always be an issue, but what we can do is weaponize our people with education, and our college degree numbers, our literacy numbers, and our high school diploma numbers are increasing as a country. So you're never going to have a completely demagogueless society. There will always be people trying to subvert the American people, but we can weaponize them with education.
Rory, you want to jump in there?
Yeah, I was just thinking about because I think what was referred to before about how people's intelligence levels have risen up, but we have to average it out the same every year. I think that's being referred to as the Flynn effect, and whether that's because of new information or improved diets, I don't know. But I was thinking about how if we were to have a national popular vote, which branch of government would be in charge of setting the voter requirements, and how would that be amended, and how do we protect that from partisan will? So that, racism was brought up before. If we had a president who was even more extreme than Trump, and a House or Senate that was in that alley as well, how do we prevent such a force from getting control over voting requirements in any given decade? National.
You brought up federalism earlier and how the federalist aspect of it protects the election. We can keep Article 1, Section 4 and allow states to designate the time, place, and manner. All we have to do is change how we count the votes.
Can I throw another student question in here or another audience question?
Yeah, you know what, we're gonna have one more audience question and then I think we're gonna wrap up. So give us a good one, Jen.
Well, I'm sorry. I apologize to everyone who doesn't get heard. Currently, only 2 states use a system of proportional granting of electoral votes. Would a nationwide transition to this system allow for greater representation for rural voters and address other concerns of voter disenfranchisements from both sides of the debate?
I feel like that's just taking the issue and multiplying it by 2. The Electoral College right now has the 51 different districts, and I am sure if you would take Nebraska and Maine and split it up, it's the same, but it's effectively the same thing. Whether you have 30 electoral states per se that are winner takes all or 60, the issue remains the same. If you're not having a popular vote that makes the people feel that their entire vote is represented, that it is equivalent to people outside of the state, then it's not the same. Like the issues of the Electoral College last into that situation which you speak of.
I'd like to make one point. I believe Amaan had brought up the concept of voter apathy in the context of winner-take-all contests within the states. If you're in a blue state and you're a red voter, better not turn out because there's no chance. How is that influence alleviated by a national popular vote when we may become a safely blue country or a safely red country? How is your minority vote encouraged in a winner-take-all on the national level?
So to preface, let's begin with how does the Electoral College solve that? You can argue that the nation is becoming safely blue or safely red on a national level, and the issue still persists. But now let's take a look at the national level. I argue that by increasing voter turnout and representation, which we show in swing states does slowly happen, and there's a correlation there, you're going to have people vote on both sides. And the argument that our nation is going to be safely blue or safely red is quite one to make, because the fact is it's close. Even though Biden right now is leading or has led Trump by around 6 million votes to what he has, that's still marginally small in comparison to the number of voters or eligible voters we have today. If anything, I argue that by making it a national vote, by having people feel like their votes are represented, you talked about 90 million voters abstaining, more are going to vote. Voter representation is good.
Not to mention that in regards to the original question, Maine and Nebraska have had their amendment to the winner-take-all formula since at least 2001. No other state has given up the privilege they get in the Electoral College since. So that shows that the system is unequal because states aren't willing to do the reforms that Maine and Nebraska have to equalize their opportunities. And to just jump back to Tom's question, I think the problem is that you would never have a safely blue country. We would become blue and violet, or we would become red and pink, or there would be some sort of similar division because you're always going to have a factor pushing either to the left or to the right. There are districts in Canada you can look at with proportional representation or single member districts where you have like a left center party and a super left party, or a super left party and an even more left party. And you still have that counterbalancing force. Just because it doesn't look as red and blue as it does today doesn't mean that it's all unanimous or that voters' opinions aren't being represented. So ultimately, the Electoral College gets in the way of those voices and makes one red voice and one blue voice, and delimits the ability of a state to represent both of them at the same time.
And you know, Tom, an example of your situation that you're describing, I live in Michigan, which was a solid blue state for quite a while. But then in 2016, we flipped red, most in part to votes in my hometown, in my county near Grand Rapids. That was because people showed up. We were safely blue for a long time because Detroit and metropolitan Grand Rapids and Lansing carried the state, and there was lower voter turnout among rural voters in Michigan. That's just a fact. In 2016, those rural voters showed up in turn because they thought their vote mattered. Because
sorry, Katrina, no, that's great. I'm gonna jump in here. I mean, I wish we could spend hours talking about this. The audience might say, no, we've got a good idea of this. So we want to just give you each side about 2 minutes to make a closing argument. So if you want to add something to that, so why don't we, if you just have any leftover comments that you were thinking, I worked so hard preparing this argument and didn't get to throw it in there, this is your moment. So go ahead, students, since you were sort of speaking there, if someone from the students or a couple people, if you want to take about 2 minutes and just any closing remarks, go right ahead here, students.
So today we talked about the popular vote and the electoral vote. And as the side that wants no electoral college, we've provided numerous reasons why popular vote is beneficial in comparison to the electoral vote. But on the flip side, we've really only seen reasons why the popular vote is bad, not why the electoral college is good. So when we look at that, we're going to be looking marginally what better represents the people. Where do we see more positives? Where do we see better voter turnouts? And through the argumentation and what we've agreed upon today, I can safely say that we've agreed that voter turnout would be increased underneath a popular vote administration, and it would better represent the wishes of American people. So marginally speaking, we should look to what's beneficial overall rather than poking holes, because that's easy.
So I'll close us out. And
so Michael's speaking on behalf of the alums here, in case anyone who's not following along at home. Michael will give the alum closing statement here.
Yeah, to give some of the reasons Amaan was asking about. So firstly, the Electoral College just adds a useful degree of stability. We as a society have agreed to follow it for 2.5 centuries, and though tradition in and of itself isn't a reason to keep something, the political stability from all of us agreeing to one system and that adding legitimacy is a useful end. In addition to just being an agreed upon system, it encourages compromise and coalition by forcing disparate groups to come together to form the main political parties. You ultimately get a moderating influence that actually encourages coalition. And then lastly, if we're gonna change the electoral system of our country, we should make sure we aren't opening Pandora's box and uninviting unintended consequences. So the direct popular vote is cast as a democratic reform. Well, it's in actuality a majoritarian reform. We only have to look at the previous century of minorities coming forward and advocating for their own civil rights to see that those missions and social initiatives needed a degree of government intervention to function. And so if we just have a majoritarian system that is catering to the political interests of the majority, then minority groups aren't getting as much of a foothold in government representation. So thank you guys for putting this on. That's the end of our closing statement.
All right, well, I will say that you have all successfully convinced me that we should get rid of the Electoral College and continue to keep the Electoral College. So I have been convinced by both sides. You did an excellent job. And so I just want to say on behalf of myself, Professor Whidden, Professor Strain, the honors program, I will tell you personally, I am so impressed with, first of all, everything that the alums are doing and that they were willing to come back and share their time with us. And also the current students. I am so impressed with how well you articulated your positions. As I said, both sides convinced me, so I would be a terrible judge on this. Thank you to the audience for coming and participating, and just everyone have a wonderful night. Hopefully you're leaving now thinking more about this issue that gets a lot of time, on by the talking heads, but now at least maybe you will have some better ammunition for whichever side of the argument you actually do agree with. So I don't know if Professor Whidden wants to add anything else.
No, I just want to thank Professor Sholar for being the co-chair of the panel, and Professor Strain for fielding questions, and students, alums, just awesome. I always say that nothing that Loyola honor students do surprises me, and I'm surprised tonight. None of you, well, few of you are, Mary mentioned she's a political science major, Rory's an economics major. Many of you have a background in the sciences, and you just blew me away tonight and exceeded expectations. Nice job, everybody. Terrific.
I agree. All right, thank you all for coming.